Sorry for the delay. Grad school is a bitch. I'll try to post throughout the day, but it will probably be sporadic at best. I also didn't save my original word vomit, so I am going to have to reread my journal to remember all the details. Anyways, I'll just jump right into it. Be me. First year of my undergrad has just ended. Despite all the support I've had, I was admittedly driverless and depressed. My family started to take note of this and came up with a plan to try and put me on the right path. As you can probably guess from the last story, my father finally divorced her and gained full custody over all my siblings. We were old enough to survive on our own, but as a way to try and make up for our mother's behavior, he tried to be more active in our lives. Upon hearing my older brother tell him about my general outlook on life, he decided this summer would be a great time to spice up my resume he'd be bugging me to do things for. My father had become, while not a rich millionaire, pretty well off financially from all his hard work and traveling, and remarried an Ecuadorian woman. Considering where we started out, it really shows what hard work can do. Being a bio major interested in genetics, using my father's surplus of free air miles and my stepmother's connections, they decided to send me to the Galapagos Islands. I feel like I was such a jerk off looking back because I just didn't want to go. I wanted to stay home and just vegetate. I wasn't spoiled enough to even think about turning down such though, and left with complaint. I think it was early June when I landed on the island of San Cristobal. Despite my hesitation, it wasn't like I wasn't excited about being there at all. I had 2 months ahead of me of long work days though, and the hard work was daunting, made being there cheap AF though. Coming off the plane, I immediately was disappointed by the hostel I was living in, pig-related. Third world living conditions, cockroaches and spiders the size of my hand combing everywhere including my bed, and wild animals making every second of the day and night as loud as they could. I lived and worked with dozens of other volunteers from around the world and would build bonds lasting to this day with many of them. It's so funny how I was upset coming in the first day, because starting the next day it would be the greatest and most exciting 2 months of my life. I even held hands with girl for the first time. I could go on a million-line Greentext about the whole amazing experience volunteering there, but this is /x/ and I wouldn't be telling this story if something odd didn't happen. This story takes place in my last week on the archipelago. I worked my ass off so much that I, along with the 3 other people in this story, got the last week to fuck off. While I came to love San Cristobal, I wanted to spend this time traveling to the other islands. For $20 or so you could take a speedboat to different islands. After mapping out our final plan the night before, we left early the next morning. Got a huge goodbye from the cutie pie French girl I held hands with. Now for some background on the people with me, names are obviously changed. First there was Max. A tall German with perfect English, he was there before I and was almost like a mentor when getting used to the islands despite his younger age. Next was Anne, another German but a short girl. She spoke again perfect English and Spanish. Max and I didn't pick up all that much Spanish at the time. And finally was this half Ecuadorian from Switzerland named Andre. I knew him for over a month, and while his Spanish was perfect, his English was pretty bad, only slightly better than my Spanish. Our end goal was to arrive at the Isla Isabela and try and swim with some penguins and do some camping. Before then though, we need to pass through the central island, Santa Cruz. It was by far the worst and most touristy island. I say this talking about a string of beautiful tropical islands, so I'm not saying it was bad. Just due to the timing of the speedboats, we had to spend at least one night there. Luckily there was lots to do while we waited there, and we made our way over to one of the beaches we heard about. Once we got to Tortuga Bay, I like saying this beach's name, we wasted no time jumping into the water and swimming with the animals. As usual, it was a pretty good time. But this was the first of a series of bad decisions we made that would lead to probably the most terrifying experience of my life. I can remember the jerk-off Andre saying in his broken English our stuff open while he pointed at our bags we left on the beach. We told Andre to keep an eye on the bags, which he didn't, and as a result we were robbed. Thankfully it seemed like only the money we brought with us was stolen, which wasn't too bad since we had to pre-buy all our tickets. Still, this meant we had to cut back on our spending. No more hotels. As angry as I was at Andre, none of us were watching them, so I couldn't be too mad. We spent the night sleeping on the docks watching the pelicans get chased around by the schools of little sharks. Daybreak came and we hopped on our boat to Isabela. The normal trip time was 3 or so hours, but it took us almost 5 because of the gale that intercepted us. The sight of the island piercing through the storm was awing. The waves were so large and powerful that the sound and sight of them crashing into the black could be noticed a kilometer away from the island in the middle of the storm. The peaks of the island were covered by the clouds, with only the volcanic peak of the Midas glowing through the clouds. As haunting as the island seemed, I'll spoil it and tell you this isn't another ghost story. As quickly as the storm came, it passed, and by the time we set foot on the island, the sun was shining. We spent our first day there familiarizing ourselves with the island and trying to spot penguins. I love those little guys, and while I didn't swim with them, I did see enough to satisfy me. With that off our bucket list, we went off to try and camp out in the island. We also took note of how skittish the locals were. The little town we came to, Porto Viamil, looked like one of those pictures of an area that was hit by a tsunami. Another thing we had to watch out for was the wild dogs. On the other islands they were at worst big and overly friendly, but here they were all big aggressive pit bulls and other big dogs that probably grew large on the local wildlife. Either way, we were determined to go camping and we started on our journey. We decided to take one of the set-up trails and move into the wilderness of the island at its end. If you know anything about these islands, you'd know that this is a bit of a no-no. After a month or so of helping the island from the damage mainly caused by those ungrateful locals, we were regretfully quick to disregard the rules on that. The customs between island didn't even care enough to stop us from bringing machetes and camping equipment, so why would we care? The 5 kilometers path lead to an old wall known by the locals as the Wailing Wall. The islands were once penal colonies, and this wall was one of the last standing parts of an old sugar factory or something. Their independence was bloody, or so they claim. Behind the wall was the vast expanse of the island, running hundreds of kilometers, I think, to the north. At the end of the path we were met with a sign, warning about hunters. The locals liked to hunt the invasive species they brought to the islands like the goats. While this seems like a good thing, they would have been completely wiped out if it wasn't for the fact that the locals kept them alive so they could sustainably hunt them. Despite the massive size of the island, less than 2,000 people live there, so we figured it would be pretty unlikely we'd run into anyone. Andre, who had visited these islands before, also assured us we'd be fine, and the locals just had those up to keep visitors from getting hurt. We only had a few hours of daylight left, so we didn't have much time to nut up. The days all feel so short on the equator. After a mile, I'm sorry for switching back and forth, my brain worked in miles but the signs we in km, or 2 more, we started to set up our first camp for the night. It is surprisingly tough to find a good spot because of how the islands were laid out. Closest to the shores were the beaches, which were either rocky or filled with sea lions that out of respect and our safety we didn't want to bother. Going inward, the beaches were replaced with swamps, rocky wastelands, and mangrove forests, all of which we really couldn't comfortably camp out in. This left the mountainous areas. You could tell where the clouds meet the mountains because at those points the general rocky terrain became lush rainforests. The ground was soft and the trees bared fruit. Settling at about the tree line, we started breaking out our gear. Again, thanks to the shitty customs, we smuggled a whole host of gear we shouldn't have had. This included some alcohol. As the night came on, everyone other than myself got a bit drunk. The 2 Germans were really hitting it off, so they shared a tent while I was stuck with Andre. I had to clean up the little mess we made since everyone was already asleep. As I was about to hit the hay myself, I heard the sound of a gunfire off into the night. I remember thinking out loud, man, it sure would be dumb to get shot. That unsettled me a bit, but not wanting the adventure to end and being with my new friends empowered me to get over it and go to sleep. As it drifted off, I remember the sounds of raspy howling. I managed to get to sleep, and in my next memory was waking up to the Germans throwing a cup at my head. With so few hours in the day, we had to get moving early. We were low on food since we didn't have the money to buy more going into this, so we began picking some from the trees. I got a bit too careless and ended up falling from an avocado tree. Back to the ground, I could hear my friends laughing at my misfortune in their respective languages. That when the bush next to my head began to hiss at me. I was surprised, but after working with the animal it came from so much, I was able to figure out what was going on right away. After a moment, a giant tortoise stretched through the bush. I guess the sound of my fall freaked it out a bit. As it moved completely out of the bush, I was greeted with a scared shell of an at least 400 pounds creature. It almost looked like it was the shell of a sea turtle whose shell was hit with a boat. I didn't put too much thought into it and we all left the site. We liked the view from the beach, so as we moved we headed towards the beach. We had no real set destination and we wandered the beach. About midday, while we were taking a break from all the walking, we noticed the sea lions in the distance bolting for the water. Out of the blue, a small pack of big dogs were closing in on us. While we had machetes, we were pretty outmatched and tried to escape. The dogs were way too fast and we had no time to pick up any gear that wasn't already on us. There was a patch of extremely jagged volcanic rock that we fled onto. Thankfully it was too much for the dogs and they didn't follow us. With some extra motivation with me throwing rocks at them, they moved on. I took note of an especially huge pit bull that seemed to be the leader of the pack. The dogs seemed to be really booking it out of there at one point after noticing something we had. As we were catching our breaths, another figure began to approach us. It was too tall to be a dog, so we assumed it was a local. As much as I'd rather not get in trouble, after the dogs I really didn't mind any help. It was flying towards us and it quickly became apparent that it wasn't a person. It was an all-black figure on all fours effortlessly moving over the black rocks that littered the ground. It took us all a second to react before yet again we found ourselves running. While it wasn't as fast as the dogs, it was more than able to keep pace over the rocks. It slowed down as it started to tail us, just staying out of reach. While running, the only feature I could make out was its massive white teeth that contrasted its black body. I think we all knew its hesitation would last and we all bolted to some huge cacti sticking from the rocks. Never before have I climbed an object so quickly. I don't remember feeling an ounce of pain that the spikes caused in the moment. The head of the beast slammed into the base of my cacti as I just got out of its reach. I looked over to see Andre in his own cacti with the two Germans in another. I strained every muscle to get a footing and not slide down. My cactus was just a single column and, judging by its reaction to the impact, not very stable. I picked the short straw. As the adrenaline wore off, I got a chance to study with creature now pacing around us. Its most defining feature was its massive head. It took up at least a third of its body. It looked like it could barely hold it up. I was finally able to pick out its eyes, which were all pupil. Its eyes were huge and unblinking, focusing on its prey. Its snout had whiskers that seemed almost comically long. A little lower was its mouth, lined with different teeth and at least 2 sets of canines. Its body looked almost like a dog's, but covered in scales like that of a marine iguana, but smoother. I started to notice the pain from the spines sticking into me and felt my grip going. I called over to my friends to try and think of a way out. The thing in response bolted at me and again rammed my cactus. For what felt like an eternity we tried to communicate with our hands whenever we could between gripping the cacti. Evening was coming and things didn't get better. The blood that pooled still at base of the cacti was being sniffed and lapped at by the beast. Looking at the huge eyes and dark body, I figured this thing would fuck us once it got dark. We are able to communicate to each other that we needed to bolt for the rainforested area we came from. We could climb the trees and stay there till the thing moved on. Maybe sensing our desperation, the creature moved behind some rocks. Only after writing the journal did I realize it was peeping for an ambush. Anne told me later that it was still in view for her, and it was focusing on me. With the deepest breath of my life, we dropped from the cacti and bolted for the tree line. The monstrous form of the creature leapt from the rocks and gave chase. Like it was fucking with us by staying just out of reach. About 100 feet from the tree line, the creature seemed to be over with playing with us and lunged at me. It let out that raspy roar I remembered from the night before as it closed in. Max, being a fucking bro, threw his machete at the thing, grazing its face. It seemed like this save brought us enough time, but at the same time Anne lost her footing and fucked up her ankle. The roar startled her. Max threw one of her arms over her shoulder, and after being saved I rushed over to help. Andre was well into a tree already as we dragged her to the tree line. The thing followed but kept some distance. We dragged her up a huge avocado tree, or maybe we were next to an avocado tree. It seemed like the thing could climb, and again just passed around the trees for a bit. Our footing was perfect in the trees and it seemed like it figured that out quickly. Defeated, it left into the night. Behind those deep eyes was a thinking creature. Later in life I learned a lot about vertebrate evolution in college. One group of creatures drew my attention like no other. Synapsids, or stem mammals, are the group of reptiles that would eventually lead to modern mammals. Before the dinosaurs, they ruled the land. Out of them came the therapsids, which further brought them to a mammal-like state. My teacher owned a cast of a creature belonging to the order, and I was shocked with how similar it looked to the creature I saw in the past. I am quite certain looking back that this animal is a member of one such creature from the order Gorgonopsid. The resemblance to Pic related is unnerving to me. It took us a moment to talk. We didn't say a word about what happened and just talked about getting the fuck out of there. With some rope we tied Anne up to the tree and applied the first tad. It was clear Anne was gonna need some help to move anywhere. We tried our best to rest in the trees, but the sound of pitter-pattering feet kept us on edge. While it seemed to come from much smaller creatures, it was clear there was more than one out there. My heart dropped as I heard the sound of cracking. The only thing I could compare it to was the sounds from a video of an alligator eating a turtle. What was going on out there probably wasn't too different. Further up the mountain we could see fire and hear gunshots. Andre muttered we should need go up to it. We agreed, but would wait till next morning. Going down there with no visibility wasn't an option. Morning came, and while we weren't well rested, we were ready to move out. We decided that we would leave Anne in the canopy and come back with help. Max grabbed her hand and promised her he'd be back for her. It was in German, but I like to imagine he said something along those lines. The peak ended up being on a whole different mountain. By midday it became clear that it would get dark before we got there. Evening came and we ascended the mountain. We were sent into a panic as we heard the sound of dogs behind us. The brush was being disturbed violently enough for us to hear it a ways back. Our spring of activity also sent a more nearby patch of foliage into a fit as well. The mountainside became so steep we ended up crawling on our hands and feet. We shot through the tree line onto flattened land. We were quickly noticed by the various dogs chained to trees which barked their alarms. Any one of those things would have fucked us up. The locals crawled out their shacks kicking glass bottles out of their way as they moved towards us. They were carrying weapons, which at least in the moment seemed natural since we just barged into their little town in the night. One with a bat walked up to us and shouted something in Spanish at us. I'm not sure about Max, but I was at least not in a state to understand Spanish in the moment. Whatever he said though made Andre's face pale. The two seemed to argue in Spanish for a moment before Andre motioned his hands at Max and I. I was just beginning to adjust and I was pretty sure he was selling us out. Out of nowhere the man smashed the bat on Andre's head. Without a second thought Max and I threw ourselves down the mountain through the tree line. The sound of firearms going off and the dogs bolting got us back on our feet from the fall and running. The commotion of us moving through the brush and the dogs now barreling down the mountain drew out an animal that was probably following us up the mountain. It was another one of those black things but much smaller than the one that chased us. Coming out into the open between us and the dogs, it was mauled instantly. I almost felt bad as I glanced back at it in the moment. Even though the sounds of gunfire didn't stop, the dogs seemed preoccupied. Yet again I was saved by chance. We ran through the night on high alert, picking fruit when we passed them. By late morning we managed to return to where we left Anne. After explaining the situation to Anne we were stumped. It seemed like the only way to get out of this was to beeline to Porto-Viamil. Before we left though we needed to rest. For some reason we thought we should go back for Andre. With Anne the way she was and Max kinda saving my ass, I told them to go while I went back. I think deep down my pride was wounded by how selfless Max was, so I had something to prove. I would leave after them so I could rest a bit more, but the moment the two of them started moving the big black creature appeared again. I threw a rock at it, hitting it in its big eye. With a snarl it jumped in the other direction. I hopped out of the tree I was in and made a shit loud of noise. I hope I seemed selfless cause I was about to pee myself away running from those Germans. I made my way back towards that settlement we were chased out of. I got to the point where we heard the dogs the last time and saw some disturbance a bit off the path. I thought it would be some stupid horror movie shit to go over there, but I needed to see. In the center of some torn up plants was the body of the big pit bull that seemed to lead the pack that attacked us before. The massive dog was partially eaten, but the black strips of flesh on the ground and dangling from what was left of its mouth showed it for sure put up a good fight. The scene was enough to make me reconsider my plans and instead try to move towards Porto-Viamil too. I got high enough to spot where I needed to go. There was a mangrove forest/swamp between me and Porto-Viamil I could cut through to get there. I spent the rest of that day in a half jog. There was enough solid ground between the wet patches of swamp and mangrove trees to keep a comfortable pace. Night came and passed and I hadn't had an issue. Feeling home free, I slowed my pace enough to watch some of the birds, the reason I was on the island to begin with. Morning passed and I could see the wailing wall I passed so many nights ago. I was almost in a daze looking. A group of flamingos in the swampy water when out of nowhere they jumped into flight. Startled myself, I saw the creature coming towards me through the mangrove. I jumped into the water hoping it wouldn't follow. My brain moving in overdrive realized how dumb of an idea that was as soon as I hit the water. This thing's tail looked like something you'd see on an alligator, and what kind of animal living on an island can't swim? I grabbed for a vine to pull myself out of the swamp. The water must not have been that deep because as I pulled myself up on the other side it just run right through the water. The webs on mangrove vines made moving difficult for both of us. I managed to stay ahead thanks to being smaller, but I had to be careful not to corner myself. The chase didn't last more than 30 seconds before I managed to start hitting dead ends. Hearing its gallop behind me close and, I pulled out my machete and swatted the thing with it. My dull machete connected with its snout but didn't manage to cut it all. It did jump back a bit. I tried to pull some vines between myself and it, but with one bite it managed to ripe the wooden vines enough for it to pass without a problem. I knew I couldn't fight this thing before, but that moment really hammered it in for me. Somewhere along my phone fell into the swamp. Rip penguin pictures. Again I was at a dead end. The vines were much thicker here and I was cornered. Things were moving in slow motion as it came closer to me. The whole life flashing before my eyes thing had never happened before or since then. I threw my machete at its head and turned away from me for a moment. Out of pure reflex from 15 years of wrestling, like taking a shot, I grabbed its front leg and threw myself by the thing. I guess it didn't expect that and it fell through some of the vines. That misstep with its huge head having trouble maneuvering around the dead end, it seemed unable to move for the moment. Without looking back I ran as fast as I could to the wailing wall and onto the established path, shitting my pants literally in the process. I didn't see those things ever again after that and met up with the Germans who beat me there. For the last 2 days we had on the island till our boats arrived, we just spent the time sitting around reflecting what had happened. We went to the police on the island, but they seemed completely disinterested and kicked us out of the station. I never saw Andre again, but I suspect his story didn't end on that island. If it did though, plenty of people fall to their deaths on those islands, and he may have just been written off as one of those. I eventually returned back to the States, and still keep in contact with Max. This was by far the most messed up stuff I ever had to deal with in my life, but looking back now I just feel bad about those things. They were just trying to live as they had been on those islands before we came. I'd like to go back one day and try to find them again, when I am more properly prepared. All these pictures are things I or my friends took, so while they are authentic, they weren't taken during this ordeal. I enjoyed writing out this again, and I hope you guys found it interesting.